Ok. Bom, pessoal, bom dia. Estamos aqui mais uma conversa do Arquiteturas do Sul Global, com a Khensani e com a Solange. Manda ver, Marco.
Bom, vou fazer só fazer um teste, ver se o áudio está funcionando certinho. Se vocês puderem dar um ok aí para nós, ver se está tudo certo. Acho que, por enquanto, né?
Tem um delay, né? Então eles acabam...
Daqui a pouco vai aparecendo. Bom, como a gente já vem fazendo nos últimos 2 encontros, né? Esse é o Arquiteturas do Sul Global. É um curso livre realizado pela Escola da Cidade, organizado pelo Pedro Vada e por mim. E a gente já está no nosso 3º encontro do curso, né? E, enfim, antes de começar a falar rapidinho do curso, eu queria agradecer à Escola da Cidade por ter realizado essa conversa aberta, gratuita, e, enfim, a gente acredita que é a melhor forma de abordar esse tema e fazer a apresentação das convidadas e dos convidados que a gente vai ter nos próximos encontros também, né? O curso ele faz parte de vários cursos livres realizados pela Escola da Cidade, né, que tem, enfim, conteúdos de temáticas diversas, né, para todos os públicos. E também queria aproveitar para agradecer a equipe do Baú da Escola da Cidade e a equipe de design que está fazendo essa comunicação visual incrível que vocês têm acompanhado pelas redes sociais, tanto as nossas redes como as redes da Escola da Cidade também. Queria agradecer ao nosso público, vocês que estão escutando e acordando no sábado de manhã para a gente bater esse papo todo, né? Enfim, criar esse vínculo que a gente está criando aos sábados de manhã nesse nosso café da manhã. E, bom, o curso a ideia do curso, basicamente, é a gente ter uma outra visão do que a gente foi acostumado a ter durante a nossa formação na faculdade, etc., né, e pegar essas arquiteturas que estão sendo desenvolvidas hoje nessa faixa do território que a gente chama de Sul Global, que a gente está denominando assim, e... Enfim, a gente vai conversar com diversos escritórios ou coletivos de vários países, né, para tentar chegar criar uma visão diferente, uma visão mais nova da produção contemporânea de arquitetura, seja de obra construída ou também de pesquisa e gente que esteja se aprofundando nesses temas, né. Nosso primeiro encontro foi com o arquiteto de Moçambique, o Remígio Chilauli. O segundo encontro foi com o pessoal do Norte, Oficina de Criação, aqui do Brasil, de Recife. E a gente ainda vai ter outros 5 encontros com arquitetas e arquitetos do México, da Angola, da China, Uganda e Equador. Além desse encontro de hoje, né? Então, com o encontro de hoje, a gente tem mais 6 encontros. Só para dizer que a gente está fazendo a apresentação em português, embora esse seja o nosso primeiro encontro em inglês. Infelizmente, a gente não vai ter tradução simultânea, mas a nossa ideia é, depois o próximo ano, quando acabar esse módulo, a gente conseguir colocar legendas em português para dar acesso a mais gente, né? E, normalmente, nossos encontros têm 1 hora, 1h30, com direito a vocês mandarem as perguntas no chat. Vocês podem mandar a pergunta em português, a gente traduz, mandar comentários, etc. E o Vada e a gente vai traduzindo e repassando para as convidadas. Elas também têm acesso aos comentários, então elas também vão ficar de olho. Se vocês quiserem comentar em português e inglês, fiquem à vontade, até porque a Solange fala um pouco de português também. Vada, se você quiser apresentar elas, fica à vontade.
Bom, queria reforçar o agradecimento à Escola da Cidade inclusive na pessoa da professora Mariana, por proporcionar essa discussão num campo mais aberto mesmo, né? E queria agradecer também já a disponibilidade da Khensani e da Solange para essa conversa. Logo elas foram os primeiros nomes que apareceram quando a gente começou a formalizar esse curso. Tem uma trajetória incrível mesmo. E aí é um pouco o perfil dos convidados, das convidadas desses encontros, que geralmente não são pessoas que estão atuando há muito tempo, né? Por mais que elas estejam atuando profissionalmente há relativamente pouco tempo, já tem uma produção e uma discussão muito interessante, muito grande. Bom, o papo de hoje é com o coletivo Matri-Archi, Matri-Archi, tecture, que é um coletivo interseccional que reúne mulheres negras africanas com o objetivo de constantemente fomentar diálogos e estimular a consciência na espacialidade, trazendo à tona a necessidade de um espaço interseccional, colaborando assim com o empoderamento e desenvolvimento de cidades em África. Desse projeto, desse coletivo, dos trabalhos que vem desenvolvendo, a gente tem a Khensani de Klerk, de Johannesburg, da África do Sul. Tem o foco do seu trabalho, da sua pesquisa, na normalização da arquitetura como uma ferramenta, de fato, interseccional, que dá suporte para as pessoas como atuantes na construção do espaço. Atualmente, seu doutorado na Universidade de Cambridge, pesquisa espaços seguros para as vítimas de violência de gênero, faz parte também do coletivo Unguta, que exibiu um projeto intitulado Disruptive: The Growth Repository of the Southern Ecosystems, na Trienal de Oslo, em 2019. E temos também a Solange Mbanefo, nigeriana, mas suíça-nigeriana, é isso?
Tá.
Arquiteta praticante, atualmente trabalhou em colaboração com o Centro de Estudos Africanos da Universidade de Basel, na Suíça, e no programa Urbanismos Críticos. Ela é fundadora de uma empresa de arquitetura voltada para a tecnologia chamada Shima. A gente pode mandar os links depois nos comentários para vocês darem uma olhada. Inclusive, essa empresa Shima vale muito a pena. A Solange tem uma formação muito cultural e já viveu, estudou e trabalhou na Suíça, na Nigéria, na Tailândia, na Itália, no Brasil, em Cuba, na Irlândia e na Índia, e fala umas 37 línguas. Ela, como a gente falou, ela fala português, então também vocês podem sentir à vontade. De novo, essa conversa vai ser em inglês, se no futuro próximo a gente pretende legendar essas conversas para ter mais acesso. Khensani and Solange, it's with you. Thank you very much to accept the invitation to spend this time with us. So thank you very much.
Thank you. We will go ahead and share the screen. Okay, I just press present. Bear with me.
Yes.
Oh, one moment. Sorry. All right. Okay, so hello, everybody. Thank you firstly to Pedro and Marco for inviting us to be part of this extremely important lecture series, an open and free opportunity to get involved in discourse, which we are extremely passionate about. We also continue to follow the other sessions and very attentively looking forward to getting involved in these conversations across the built environment. So to begin, we just play a video and then we'll go on from there. Matri Architecture is an intersectional collective that brings African women of color together for the empowerment and development of African cities within the realm of spatial education. Matri Architecture produces knowledge that constantly aims at catalyzing and fostering dialogue while encouraging consciousness and spatiality, bringing to the forefront the need for an intersectional space. Matri-Archi works to empower its network with established practice and education partners to reframe the various sectors related to design and the city. We are a voice and a nexus, a ripe site of emerging and progressive thinkers of African descent who will inevitably contribute to the future of spatial Africa. So firstly, just to mention that this video was featured in an exhibition that we did last year at the Cape Institute for Architects in Cape Town, South Africa. It was hosted by Soft Stuff and The Mark, which featured young practices who are gearing their efforts toward practice locally in South Africa. And we thought that that is quite a fitting introduction to sort of introduce ourselves. Of course, we keep mentioning this term intersectional collective. By way of introduction, that's Solange, you can see on the screen as well, and that's me. We're currently co-directing the collective together, and as Pedro and Marco mentioned, I'm from Johannesburg, South Africa. Solange is from Nigeria, or Lagos, Nigeria, and I'm pursuing studies in the UK or research graduate studies, investigating the relationship between public infrastructure and urban violence experienced by Black women and women of color in Cape Town, in response to the long-standing crisis of gender-based violence, which is a planetary issue. Solange, as you've all sort of been introduced, is a practicing architect. She's based in Switzerland right now and is founder of the company Shimmer, which specializes on information modeling design solutions for affordable housing units that generate revenue and reflect local sensitivity. So we constantly use our own initiatives and our own sorts of passionate projects which come into this collective, and we sort of present our own backgrounds as a way of describing how other people in the collective also pursue their own sorts of trajectories, but they all filter in terms of the same theme into Matri-Archi. So we're all geared at empowering African women in architectural education and the built environment, which bleeds into construction a bit. We founded this collective in 2017. We met in Switzerland, and ever since then, we continue to place ourselves in a position where we can shift and grow as everybody contributes different skills. We're 12 or about 12, it shifts. A pluridisciplinary collective, graphic designers, filmmakers, architects, planners, urban geographers, who are all trying to put our efforts towards the same thing. And so to move on, as a collective, we find ourselves situated at the praxis or in the intersections of discursive and physical geographies, which we have been able to do online since our conception. And so there are some people in the collective who have yet to meet each other. Solange and I sort of brought this collective together, but we have for a very long time been functioning online, which we find is really fitting for this sort of engagement. And we consider this growing digital landscape invaluable, given that it has made this sort of conversation possible across global southern geographies, if you like, and very quickly becoming the new normal, as we can all see. And so to briefly discuss how our lecture will go on, and please do feel free to interrupt us at any point, add to the comments section, or let us know if you'd like to respond to the slide that we're on. But just to explain how we have structured it, we'll expand across these multiple geographies, these different types, And Solange will begin by introducing our multi-locality approach through a built installation that we did in 2018. And then she will follow with a theoretical and critical unpacking and understanding of our research and practice as a mode of reading. Thereafter, I will describe how we read the world through historical case studies that we've done in our previous research that we've published online, and then furthermore explain how the ongoing project that we're doing, which is parts research, parts design, kind of thinks about how we use our collective as a space for testing and prototyping, and in line with our transformative ethos allows us to develop our understanding of a diverse or a diversifying world. So I hand the mic over to Solange.
Good afternoon, bom dia a toda gente. So I'm going to start with prototype 1 that we built, and the title was A Threshold, a Space, an Entrance to Occupy and to Move Through. So our agenda included being able to disrupt an institutional through institutional resistance. We were going to be able to go through the cracks and the barriers and manifest our occupations in these spaces. So it was a movable object, which was a prototype that seeks to represent an element of Matri-Archi on the fundamental human scale level. So it was the height, the intervention, the forms, and the dimensions were all calculated in forms of also in which most crucial and critical importance of design actually interest and move into the movement of the house to the building, to the street, to the block, to the city, and the globe. And I'll explain this as we move on. So next slide would be, so the prototype therefore aims to hone on the sort of fourth industrial revolution by exploring the interface between these two forms of existence, blurring the binary of being either there or here, and introducing a new perspective of occupying both at the same time. Since we operate digitally, as we had already mentioned, as Khensani mentioned already, when we do manifest ourselves in a place as architects, as spatial practitioners, blurring between the digital and the physical is always a very interesting game to play around with. And so, as you can see in the next slide, simply it's that the digital aspect of the pavilion acts as an immediate teleporter, as we call it, between the global north and the global south, blurring that boundary. And in the next slide, you can see that how this speaks great volumes when rethinking our ability to transport ourselves digitally with AI and other values of physical experience in the ever-tightening global community that we're living in. And so as we made this pavilion, as you noticed, there was a QR code in the previous slide, and when you scanned it, there were videos that were shown, and each time we presented the prototype, there were different videos for the scenes and the intervention that we had. And so in the next slide, we're going to show the video that was out for Threshold, a Space, an Entrance to Occupy, to Move Through. And we can play it, I think. Yeah. The pavilion tells stories of migration as a physical artifact. What lives in the present when activated from within, allowing the viewer to watch multiple readings of two cities at the same time, Milan and Cape Town were our case studies. And from there, as we see, the prototype does not signify a beginning or end, but it's rather framed in these notions to represent a place in which you can dwell by being physically held and or concurrently extend your physicality and move through space digitally, somehow still coping a stationary position in the physical space. So this is where we have moved it throughout the campus that we exhibited in St. Gallen in Switzerland. And in the next slide, you see some of the drawings of our construction details that show how it was imagined to be modular, sustainable, reusable, and transportable, as we call it, teletransportable to new places and spaces of existence. In the next slide, you can see a closer detail of the built form as we worked with local wood, and we hand cut all the pieces and had them into a sort of Lego format that you could put together and take out. And as you've noticed, there's a very interesting curtain raffia mat that you see in the next slide that emphasizes even further by being held in an envelope of raffia, our prototype that was physically transported by Khensani in her suitcase from South Africa, and it was crafted by a collective of Congolese women in Cape Town. And so it was in itself, its existence, a very interesting mash of global North, global South, reunification in itself. And so in the next, and we can switch slides. So the value of creating and manifesting the built environment through digital tools or across the line becomes valuable in experimenting with forms of interpretation, which arguably one would assume would lead down a path of disconnected assumptions. So in a nutshell, Matri-Archi believes that this route is ripe with opportunities of discovery in order to expose ourselves as spatial thinkers to undiscovered and sometimes unrealized, as perceived as sometimes impossible, potentials for physical built development that is the beginning of many things to come. So this was the first presentation of one of our built work that we've done in Matri-Archi. And if you have any questions after, we'll be able to answer them. Se vocês têm perguntas depois, vocês podem fazer isso da primeira edifício de construção de Matri-Archi. So in the second part that we're going to introduce now goes into rethinking, reshaping our future infrastructures, and we're going to start with the geometries of making. And this comes into the learning from the discipline of vernacular construction and exercising the full potentials of our brains. So let's dive into that. The architect has become an artist of an entirely new kind today, and capitalism was saved by the property industry and the creative arts applied to production of formal tendencies and styles and surfaces. So the art in architecture has seemed to arrange for its own dematerialization, reducing itself to a vague impression of creative sprints. And so this image that you see in the back is extracted from a reading of Paul Valéry, who describes in this book Eupalinos, or the architect, and why he looks upon architecture as the most complete of the arts, where we begin to perceive how low it has actually fallen in today. And the overview of architectural follies that are sprinkled across the world's brandscapes, as we call them, which have inevitably lost their individuality in the modern aesthetics of what is there. And in the next slide, we come down to the simple Cartesian three-dimensional plane, where we look into the topic of ideal geometries, such as the triangle, the circle, the square, proportional rectangles, etc. So there's this methodology is at the cusp of an arbitrary imposition of abstract mathematical shapes that embrace an inherent perfection. However, as we are spatial practitioners, we cannot go from the ideal perfect geometry to the built space. So if we are looking to embrace the geometries of the making, that is defined by a rigorous structural and constructional discipline with its own innate geometries that regulate the conception of a project, that's where we start wondering and seeing an interesting development of styles, of forms, of spaces to dwell and to live. And so in the next slide, it's actually quite funny because the bigger picture on the left is what we call the mandala-like structure, is literally the path of Venus. So when the motion of the planets are charted as their so-called epiclitic geocentric paths, or the shapes that their orbits have as seen from Earth, you find these interesting structures. And when you think about it, you can see Mars, that is the third one down on the left. Venus is the first one on the upper right. They have similar patterns that you re-find in nature, you re-find in the micro and the macrocosmos of things that go in. But what does this mean when it comes to knowledge? And as we are talking about how do we learn? How do we expand from the geometries of ideal to geometries of the making? And so in the next slide, you're going to see a man and his son, and this is the ancient art of wayfinding, which was an essential skill of the survival of mankind. Before, today, I don't think we can literally be on a boat and feel the waves and navigate according to the stars and the clouds and things like that. But the Polynesian navigators used to memorize the motion of specific stars. They would read the shapes of clouds that would reflect down the land masses and they would be able to know how far land would be, and the colors of the sea, the wildlife species that are represented in the water, and they would find all these fascinating ways of reading even the waves themselves. They would be crouched low in their wooden canoe, and they would navigate to find the islands of the Polynesian seas, and they would interpret it by the swelling beneath his vessel, their vessels in that sense. And so they would travel across thousands of miles only using their senses and knowledge passed by oral tradition from master to apprentice. The use of shells that you see on the right-hand side of the screen here is some way of a common practice, as many people would say. They use it with shells. They made other landmarks around to memorize it with their students, with their apprentices, to instigate memory techniques. And one could replace a physical location from the beach and rethink of another similar object that served the purpose of such education. Why are we introducing this to you? Because at the same time, if we look at the next slide here, we are looking at the art of mental capacity, mental calculations that actually drive back to the origin of the word itself. So the etymology of the word calcul is borrowed from Latin calculus, and it means pebble and stone, and it usually was practiced in the practice of using it as a memory system that allowed one to perform some form of computation or arithmetics or math quite quickly. This man that you see standing in front of the board here, his name is Jaco Trachtenberg. I don't know if I said that right, Trachtenberg. He was a Russian Jewish engineer and mathematician who advanced a new mental calculation technique called the Trachtenberg technique system, and that was developed in order to keep his mind occupied while being in a Nazi concentration camp. So in the sense of why we're going through all of this brings us down to the next slide, where the question pour un champion, as we say, is usually architecture of the built, but that derives from architecture of the mind, because that is where the whole intersectional points come together, where memory as knowledge, knowledge as movement, movement as exploration. And why am I talking about these three points here that follow each other? It's that memory actually stimulates your mind to actually be more effective, to release its own potential in its own sense. As you see, this man that was a mathematical guru survived the concentration camps by making, and he actually invented a new way of memorizing. So people have used different forms of memory to stimulate and actually grow in knowledge. But knowledge has never been static, because people and mankind are nomadic people. So knowledge has always moved. Knowledge has always migrated through things. But what does that mean? Through movement. So we will then go through these three steps, where knowledge is movement, which was a form, movement as exploration, and exploration is actually what stimulates better ideas and keeps us more relevant. And as spatial practitioners that intervene with the environment and the environment back to us, even as people, how do these three intersect is how we're just going to break that down in the next slide now. So here is the book Decolonizing the Mind by Wat Yongo. And And I put the quote in Portuguese so you guys can easily read it. But his philosophy was summed out in an interview as follows, that if you know all, and I mean all, the languages of the world, and you do not know your mother tongue, that is enslavement. If you know your mother tongue and add all the languages of the world to it, that is called empowerment. Now, what does this then mean in the deconstruction of the future of our profession as individuals that see a globalized future with English? Now we're speaking English, there's Portuguese, there are different subcultures of memory as knowledge, because as you pass a language down, as you pass knowledge down, that memory is passed in. And that means that the fact is that you used books through knowledge, through the interpretation of information to pass it down. But the fact of the matter is that you have a book, and a book is physical. And the fact is that the physical is not what qualifies the book. What qualifies the book is the intangible aspect inside it, because the empires of the future are the empires of the mind, in the sense of a quote by Churchill, which I wasn't supposed to put in here, but it's actually a very powerful quote in itself, because memory as knowledge breaks the entrance of the chapter where knowledge is transferred. So in the next slide, you shall see a very famous lawyer in the Roman Empire, Cicero. And instinctively, we're going to just break down the present to get to this image. So in 2014, there was a Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine by John O'Keefe, May Britt Moser, and Edver Moser. And they won the prize on their discoveries of cells that constitute a positioning system in our brains. That means if we look at the metaphor that I gave of the book, it has a twofold experience: the tangible, the material, and what can be lost, burned, destroyed, and manipulated. And it is limited in material because it's tangible. The intangible, which is beyond paper, which is the message that goes in. And if we now think of how lectures were passed down in the history of education, the first thing to remember is that paper was scarce, and people used to write on leather sheets called parchemin, and in French, which would cost literally a fortune at the time. It would almost cost the price of a house, because everything was written by hand. So instinctively, when you had different scholars like famous druids, poets, philosophers from the antiquity, such as Homer, then they used to practice a specific methodology of place. And this methodology of place, as the people that won the Nobel Prize have proved it, our brains have a capacity to memorize information with a locality as a place anchor. So with that in mind, we have this association with place, but it's not just with place, it's also with the senses and with space that increases our memory capacity through familiarity. So as an explanation, you have Homer that would usually leave his house, stroll down to the shore, and as he would stroll down to the shore, he would have different familiar landmarks that he would use in order to memorize by heart the entire Odyssey. In those days, it was very, very long lectures. And this brings us now to this image, who is Cicero, and he is there, a famous lawyer of the Roman Empire, as I said, and he was guiding his scholars through the temples, and he would use the pillars of the temple as place-making points and anchors to discuss his lectures to the scholars that would follow and memorize through walking through the space. So associating this is something, it's called episodial structure of memorizing things, is one of the most effective methods that has been elaborated so far. And the other thing to take into consideration, which you can see now in the next slide, is a picture that comes from the World War II archives of Eritrean men sitting under a tree and discussing medicine solutions for the community that they're there. And when you look at the African continent in general, we are tapping into the triple heritage of different cultures that today influence the world as it is. And when we come now to the point as movement, as exploration, we are now going to have to break down what this means. So I hope you're following how we got here. So we started with movement, we started as memory as knowledge, knowledge as movement, and now movement as exploration. Memory as knowledge in the way you use your memory that increases your capacity of your brain. Knowledge as movement, as you can move through space in order to memorize better, in order to learn better and pass things down, which has then become very present in oral histories and through different cultures, dances, music, traditions, and all of this have secret codes that were memorized by our ancestors, which shouldn't be lost. And now we're going down to movement as exploration, where it comes to knowledge as exploration. So when we're going to explore a space, we need to think about Leonardo da Vinci's man that's in the sphere. So that's called the kinesphere. And the kinesphere is where your entire body can stretch to. The more flexible your body is, the more surface of your kinesphere that you have tangible. Now, but the fact of your kinesphere is that it's limited to your body. But if we look at your noosphere, that is all the extension of the possibility of your ideas. And when we're trying to look at what the noosphere means, all this explanation of how your brain memorizes and how you can associate information explains how your capacity to find an idea is flexible or not. How framed are you into what you feel comfortable with and what you don't? So exploration has actually been a very interesting trait of mankind that has always pushed beyond finding solutions on the norms. So sometimes the fact is that the solution to a problem are completely independent from our modes of initial thought, which is a possibility. And so it's an invitation to explore the missing narratives in the spirit of neophilia as what actually drives good ideas, knowing that the African continent is a gold mine regarding the new ideas that could be formed from expressing interest in going into this research that is highly needed. So in the next image slide, I'm giving an example of flexibility of the mind to mingle with new currents. So these two books were written by a German explorer called Leo Frobenius, and he did one book, the one on the left with the pattern, as you can see, and this book was actually found on the desk of a very famous architect called Mies van der Rohe. This was called Überkant Afrika, which was discovering the Africa unknown. And so the different explorations that he went through and types of typologies that were literally described in this book was actually one of the key elements that drove the fundamental development of the Barcelona Pavilion and Farnsworth House. And I'm just going to read out of a quote from the books of how this was known. There was a historian that was following Mies van der Rohe since and wrote a book called The Artless World, where he was reporting in December 1923 that Mies delivered a lecture at the Berlin Bund Deutscher Architektenschool. And he was talking about how he found traditional architecture built by what he called unknown masters. And he illustrated various examples during this lecture of traditional architecture of the Indian tent, the leaf hut, an Eskimo house, an Eskimo summer tent, a Northern Germany farmhouse, and all these examples for contemporary architects. So Mies van der Rohe argued for their simplicity and directness by using modern materials such as steel, glass, and concrete to bring the vernacular down to the present of his time. And so according to Fritz Neumeyer, around the same time, he had this book opened on his desk that was recently published called Überkant Afrika. And it illustrated how these traditional buildings and artifacts from the various regions of Africa actually hold the exact same principles of the open plain, of how he divided the pavilion of Barcelona, and etc., which is just food for thought, which is very interesting in the sense of, as we see in the next slide here, which is a negative collage of the Barcelona pavilion that was done to reflect somehow the rich noosphere of Mies van der Rohe. The fact is that we need to remember that history is always written by the ones that win. You know, history, his story. So we cannot rely on how someone claims to have come to an idea, but we can believe and understand that the intersectional exercise of liberating the potential of our brains, of our imagination, of our intellectual ways of challenging memory as knowledge, knowledge as movement, movement as exploration, and not exploitation as the current educational systems have put it, because exploitation and exploration are the two dilemmas that we are dealing with in the 21st century with a curriculum that is based on the 19th century based information. So this is where I just wanted to bring in this understanding of, if someone or if other architects or scholars are pushing you as young architects within an institution, or as curious people that have a thrive for something new that may be connected to, let's say, the African continent that has been neglected from the Western Eurocentric institutions till today, well, that would actually make you a very, very, very powerful and resilient person, resilient architect, resilient intellectual, resilient person for the future. We need to be flexible. And in order to address the flexibilities of the future that we need to hold, which we will explain as Khensani will follow right now, with the formal and the informal dilemma, the fact is that us as architects need to understand that our brains have not changed from the antiquity till today. We still work by moving through spaces to learn from memory, memory as exploration out of our comfort zones. And this is the beginning of starting the new step. So I'll let Khensani take over from here. And yeah.
Thank you, Solange. And so I think to just extend and emphasize the memory as knowledge, knowledge as movement, movement as exploration, of course, reading into the sort of histories and potential ideas that we could generate as contemporary spatial practitioners requires us to take a sort of ownership of the reading that we do of these case studies, that we do through mapping, and the way in which we've done it at Matri-Archi and sort of aspire to develop in is through various modes. The first mode being reading by existing, reading and existing, and reading, therefore, the existing. Those three things happen at once. And so to kind of echo and refer to the way in which Solange has described this historical sort of shift, we currently have the status quo of architecture and buildings being something perceived to be static, perceived to be permanent, therefore produced and delivered, and in a capitalistic structure that seems to be quite suitable. In contrast to that, social life, being constituted predominantly of expressive practice, is something to be seen as separate from the sort of practice of architecture. Let's say majority of the architectural traditional education around building does not consider expressive practice at the same level of tectonics, which we think are inherently linked. Both social life and intersectional architecture, as we refer to it, require a movement, a memorizing, which can eventually allow the built environment and social life to live in some sort of symbiotic relationship wherein not just us as professional spatial practitioners are able to activate the built environment, but there might be potential and interesting and optimistic ways for us to take a shared accountability to things like climate change, which require a built environment shift, things like inequality, social justice shifts, which all require a maintenance that is recorded, projected, and activated by the general society. And so we sort of return to these sorts of diagrams. We've presented this to also show how we work, a sort of process of syntax, growing our understandings of words, and sometimes scratching words off and putting new words on. And it's also constantly in flux. And so to sort of segue into what we mean by reading by existing, we've presented a quote by a Professor Lushaba, or Professor Lwazi Lushaba, who is at the University of Cape Town, leading a program or course on political thought. In 2016, following the Rhodes Must Fall initial catalyst of protests happening across the country, which we now see making a resurgence now with statues being taken down across the world, he took to his classes to start thinking about what a decolonial and free education would mean. And of course, when we speak about free, yes, in the capitalistic structure financially, but more so echoing Solange's presentation of the decolonizing the mind, a freeing of the mind in order to refocus and revalue that is local, that might be lost if not integrated into the institution. And so I read this in English. Of course, or say Solange has translated this into Portuguese, but simply quoting Dr. Lushaba in that he says, now, one of the ways in which Black people transmit knowledge is through song and dance. So white people do not know our songs, you see. White people do not know the meanings that are encapsulated in our forms of cognizance. So how do they conclude a priori that our forms of seeing, our forms of singing, are meaningless? It is because modern thought categorizes us as Black people outside the purview of knowledge. The boundary of rationality and reason excludes us as Black people. Now, all these white institutions have been at the forefront of the production of that modern knowledge that considers us as Black people to reside behind the boundaries of rationality and reason. And so I suppose this quote speaks across many levels to what we've presented thus far, in that we are not rejecting any sort of Western knowledge, but we do actively reject any sort of canonical knowledge that focuses on one sort of mode of reading, one sort of content, one sort of curriculum as better than the other, which has maintained hegemony throughout these institutions. And so we also do find it interesting uncovering concurrent histories that happened when in placement or parallel to the histories that we were taught at university and that are still potentially taught today, which remain quite canonical. And so we try to challenge our provocations, which sound really radical, as if you like, by doing case studies, by researching, by attempting to find out more information that will help us develop our thoughts, will help us learn, and also help us develop our own thinking in spatial practice. So in 2018, we published an article, which you can find on Matri-Archi, which was looking at the sort of traditional construction maintenance model of Mali, a Mali town called Gene, which is predominantly a spiritual and demonstrative-based process. And I will begin by simply echoing a quote from that article. Our sentiments haven't changed too much since then with regards to this case study. And so it is in the practice of passing down knowledge through building and learning that construction and design methods are archived, imparted, and received in many African sites, including Gene. Every year during an annual traditional festival called the Crépissage, the city is replastered. A group of 80 or so mud masons are responsible for coordinating the preparation of clay soil for the annual event, overseeing this replastering of the city. They are able to identify and target specific areas in need of renovation, ensuring a productive process of renewal. It's a very coordinated process. The masons serve as facilitators for all of the citizens of Gene. The entire citizenship of Gene, who are able-bodied, which we acknowledge is also a huge barrier to participating in urban life. Those that are able come together in festivity to replaster the entire city. The collective input and tenacious energy put into the physical labor of relayering and re-armoring, in a sense, the city for yet another year of physical survival, we think is a brilliant case of a societal setup of cooperative contribution. More so, the expression and spiritual event of coming together as a community to replaster the city maintains a sort of user-based ownership as a normative attitude, ensuring that every person inherently respects their space and has a physical right to the city. And in this sense, the entire city of Genève remains a shared home, which for many of us living in what is sort of understood to be urban contexts, this might seem quite unfamiliar as something to experience, given that property runs access to public life, runs access to community, and runs the development of urban life. And so moving on to this image, which these were all taken by a photographer called Sophie Ravier. The physical city of Genève relies implicitly on this spiritual expression and ritual of replastering the city to armor it for another year of life, as I mentioned. And the city, we find in a really beautiful and quite literal way, is a living city, a city premised on flux. The actual built environment is constantly changing annually, which faces the potential of a sort of death in the built environment, where stasis in architectural education is seen to be ideal. The idea of status, we believe, is also a myth, in that we will all live and we'll all die, and these buildings can also experience similar stages of flux. And so the growing rarity of such impermanent and kinetic cities reveals the intrinsic, long-standing traditional DNA of architecture as a tool of aspiring for permanence. This permanence we see, as we will also present through another quote by Prof. Lushaba, we see this as a, let's say, a modern syntax, a Western syntax. And so we then ask ourselves, right, as spatial practitioners in the contemporary condition being today, having identified this issue, how are cities considered, or cities that are considered other, how will they develop and exist in contradiction to this normative syntax that we continue to learn at our universities? How are they going to survive when both practice and education today are still predominantly imposing a prescribed method of teaching and building which do not favor characteristics outside of canonical norms? And so we ask ourselves this at the top of our priority list of questions when thinking about design, when thinking about construction, when thinking about expression, when thinking about maintenance. And so, as you can see, we wrote about this, and we constantly try to draw from these sorts of existing case studies with an open ear to critique. Again, researching, writing, recording, testing, publishing, it depends what medium suits the mode. What medium suits the information. And in this case, the digital sort of conversational spaces that we engage in, and that all of us in this audience and beyond can actively create, become very useful. This does become, however, we can acknowledge, more and more challenging, given that there's an increased marketization of information online, adverts everywhere, selling of data, which altogether risks this information that we try to produce, risks it going unnoticed to the point of erasure, if not commodified. But this is one of the reasons why we constantly persist in both engaging in the digital and in the physical world, and often taking quite an active stance in trying to maintain a relationship between them in our prototype pavilion at St. Gallen, for example, which we also presented at a different event that Solange led in Basel called Creative Mornings. And so one of our future aspirations for Matri-Archi, which we'd also like to mention, is certainly thinking about how to include the physical visiting of these case study sites. Of course, there are unprecedented sorts of disruptions like the coronavirus that have occurred, which continue to make this tricky. But of course, we also describe reading through experience, and that requires physicality and a being there. At the same time, we put a huge emphasis on doing this in parallel with critique online wherein experts, and experts being locals themselves, not just professional experts, but locals, experts, participants can engage, and we hope that this can continue a sort of ethnographic approach whilst ethically maintaining the autonomy, the voices, the lost and erased voices of those who are directly affected by these sites. Looking at architectural ethics, fieldwork ethics, as something that we try to break down and focus on reading through experience rather than reading as an extractive process, which has commonly happened across architecture schools post 2000 at least. This is a screenshot from a really interesting database of, I hope that you can see this, yeah, we opened the website, an interesting database of African vernacular built forms, showing their construction, showing a bit about their history. And we present this really quickly as a little side note to mention that this is a living educational sort of journey that we're on, and it's constantly being added to, and the information is there but being uncovered, and this is where we think the digital becomes very helpful, just as a simple contribution and a collective contribution, more so. And so we read through experiencing, by experiencing, but at the same time, as a collective, you might ask, okay, right, case studies, what else? And of course, we find ourselves in the position where we are either freshly out of educational institutions or still in them, as I am. And we also read by testing, in the sense that we try to design and we try to find physical ways of implying our thoughts off outside of archives and active design that can be felt. And so we sort of present this image first, which I'm sure is familiar to everyone, this image of Wakanda from the Marvel Black Panther film, in order to sort of highlight that the design that we sort of engage in, which we would term as Afrofuturistic, goes beyond simply this sort of science fiction motif, which we think is also very helpful in that it remains a point of inspiration for us, a point of empowering Black people in various cultures across a heterogeneous global South landscape, a heterogeneous African landscape, a heterogeneous subaltern landscape. Sort of empowers a refocus on these cultures as valid, and but we do place it next to an article that we recently wrote for ArcDaily, well, not recently, at the end of last year, that we recently wrote for ArcDaily, describing ongoing research, which we would term as equally Afrofuturistic, however, very detailed in its tectonics, very detailed in its feasibility and realism in the contemporary condition, the world today. And so we just present a very short GIF to also furthermore just go on to describing our sort of investigations of urban nomadic patterns in Johannesburg, with a particular focus on the infrastructural needs of women trading at informal transport nodes. We see informal markets as systems too, that are extremely creative in challenging and mobilizing people, goods, and services in completely alternative and often unregistered ways. And so the mere existence of such systems, of such trade, of such economic sorts of modes of living highlight one of the many cracks in our belief that formality is normative, because to a large extent, informality is normative, but remains unrecognized, unregistered. And we present this GIF just simply as a provocation, a mapping departure point, and by no means intend at all to romanticize the sorts of conditions that happen around these informal systems, which sometimes are more effective than formal systems. And so one moment, sorry. So yeah, sorry, just to move back for a second to mention one more thing, is that these sort of women who situate themselves at these informal taxi stops are or selling amagwinya. In Johannesburg, you would call them amagwinya, which also means hot cakes, and other cigarettes like cigarettes. And what's interesting about this is that these women who are trading, as you can see, this woman's just sitting on a few stones, they tend to be spatial memory markers for other people who would need to know where to stop for the taxi. These women are sat on stones, facing harsh weather conditions, often to the point of having to not sell on some days when there's rain. They're there super early in the morning before everybody, the vast majority of low-income earning South Africans, get on taxis to get to work. And so the big concerns that came up for us as design parameters in the end were thinking about money safekeeping, which is a planetary issue for traders in informal conditions. And for women, a very gendered issue that is also planetary is ablution needs, as well as safety needs due to sorts of social gender-based violence, etc. And so this is the first time we present this design outside of our drawing boards. And so your critique would be really, really invaluable. But of course, this ongoing research has culminated into this design where architecture meets object design to accommodate particularly the mobility of urban nomads, which indeed allows them to continue engaging in economic life without aspiring to permanence, which, mind you, has never been the status quo in response to the informal transport minibus system. So there are no formal taxi stops for taxis, maybe a few main nodes, but on the capillary lines of these taxis, there are no formalized stops. It's something that was created by an informal market and serves majority of the country. And so to hone into this mobility, which has attached another sort of economic model to it, being these trading women, we thought to design something that could also be fundamentally mobile. And so we also explicitly do not see informal as bad and formal as good. We see them both as systems, and systems that may be appropriate in some ways or others, depending on how feasible they can be in real life. And so a few more drawings from that, showing how it looks in elevation and at its various points of being compact and set up. We sort of, by employing this object design, the prototype is impermanent and transient, giving room for it to capitalize on the dynamic condition of global southern conditions of flux. Flux is a really big word of ours. These sort of pop-up structures serve multiple urban goers. These objects become structures in the urban context, playing, as I just previously mentioned, a navigational and trade infrastructural role. More importantly, at the crux, these structures respond to the needs of this urban nomad, improving conditions for her everyday economic transactions and experiences of the bustling public realm. The object is lightweight and compactable. It provides shelter, a seat, and a recognizable structure that indicates a landmark, letting people, particularly new taxi users, letting them know that there is a taxi stop at that point. These unwritten rules that happen in public life start to be spatialized. We are quite interested in understanding placemaking through landmarks. And so the intervention, therefore, exists on both the one-to-one scale of the trader, this amagwinya selling lady, and also exists on an urban infrastructural level or scale, which is on the level of transport as a system that's constantly shifting. And so this is one of the many facets of urban life as it exists. And mind you, it also exists without the intervention of architects in global southern sites alike. And so we find ourselves being both reactive and proactive. And we also, of course, go back to good Professor Lwazi Lishaba as we approach the end of our lecture, slowly approach the end. We get another quote, which we would like to mention is also a provocation for us. It acts as a way for us to identify paradoxes in the sorts of work that we, or sorts of sites that we place ourselves in, both discursive and physical, in that it reminds us to be cognizant of our understanding of urban life, given that we are very familiar with the global northern conception of that, but have also experienced a very contradictory and juxtaposed version of that often works and brings about very wonderful aspects, sometimes not so wonderful aspects. And so I will read this in English, and of course it's in Portuguese here, where Dr. Luazi Lushaba says, the foundation of the he says, the foundation of the institution and their institutional cultures is such that they do not have categories and perspectives with which to apprehend Black modes of cognizance and Black modes of being in the world. Their categories of knowledge, their forms of knowing, their forms of teaching are only geared towards Western forms of life. In simpler terms, they are geared towards urban forms of life. So, the only forms of Black knowledge that are able to enter these universities and institutions are those forms of life, those forms of lives of Black people that turn Black people away from themselves. And at the end of their studies, make Black people not able to speak their own languages. And in this sense, we try to refer to the architectural, the spatial, the constructive, the discursive as languages that are inherently born out of histories which we have not been able to access through our conventional learning, and now take it upon ourselves to try and learn through our collective action. And this collective action is in a space of dilemma where we see many, many others across South America, across Africa, across Asia, attempting, without the reliance on the institution, to find ways of uncovering this language that we have been unable to employ and use until this point of, let's say, sort of emancipation. And so we, as Matri-Archi, are both proactive, yes, as mentioned before, and responsive, and realize that we face many challenges as contemporary Black African women in the industry. Of course, it is no secret that within this positionality and industry lies two main challenges of many. The first, or these, just to mention that these challenges perpetuate a harsh racial, class, and gender inequality in the architectural discipline, hence our existence in response to this very difficult context. So the first challenge is that Black African women have traditionally remained the minority in architecture due to historical, racial injustice and financial difficulty to continue their pursuit of the profession. Of course, as we will all know, the contemporary example of this is the typical unpaid internship, which challenges many who are affected by class stability. And of course, if there is no financial support to do that, people tend not to pursue or continue in the career. And so today we see an increase of collective action with women of color and Black women in the profession taking a long-standing effect, or who will take a long-standing effect in years to come, which we see as a long-term and patient task. And so we move then on to the second challenge, which is one of commission. It's one of access to social capital, that we can see the transformative ideas and initiatives, or that can help us see these transformative ideas and initiatives come to full fruition. Recently, we gave a talk at the ETH Zurich Parity Talks, which is an initiative that's been going on for 5 years, advocating for gender and diversity in the department. And this year, we particularly recommended that institutions who have identified that they need to reform put their walk to their talk by committing to supporting these very slow processes that their frameworks are not suited to, given that they were never made to resist any sort of change, and that in this support, they should explicitly recognize and support the efforts of collectives doing transformative work through finances and resources. Those initiatives require interest, they require energy, they require labor. And of course, at the core, passion, which is how we came together as Matri-Archi. Of course, to maintain any sort of sustainable, be it ecological or social sort of accountability, shared accountability, these sorts of acknowledgements of us functioning in a capitalistic society become really central to the types of work that we take on and the types of work that we try to disrupt when exploitative and when extractive. As Solange mentioned earlier, exploration and extraction sometimes overlay and take advantage of the sorts of interventions that collectives across the globe geared at transformation are trying to do. And so as a collective, we're currently placed at this point. We are, of course, contemporary spatial practitioners and look forward to finding how our reading, by existing, our reading through, our reading by, through, and seeing the existing can develop, and how we can hone into finding a memory that can exercise our language from a local standpoint. And this is our last slide. Our social media details are at the bottom. But maybe we end on this one. Yes.
Was amazing. I'm speechless. Maybe we have some comments here, and maybe you can read the one of Gabriela in English, because looks like more I don't know, maybe better if you read, not a white man read with a white man voice. Maybe Gabriela has a really nice comment here.
Yes.
Can you see?
Yes, Gabriela Pereira. Right, so I can read that out loud, and Solange, I don't know, you interject and let me know if you'd like to respond. And so the comment reads, the comment from Gabriela reads, the prescriptions of studies and practices of architecture prohibit or try to interdict a priori continuities that are not informed by colonial rationality, that try to relegate to contempt and small value that which is not able to control, because that is to assume your incompetence and limitation. And this is about maintaining power. And then a little bit of haha down there. But yes, so do you want to comment to that comment, which I have a few things to say, but I've been...
I would maybe just put like 3 words: ridiculous, dangerous, obvious, évident, evident. Every person that went against what was the norm, what was put into the value of what is right, was first considered ridiculous, then it was considered dangerous, and then it's obvious. So at this point, what you are discussing, as in it's obvious, it's part of revolution. It's part of any revolutionary idea that is different, that is going to change or push anything in any other direction beyond the norm. So you're right with what you have described, but does that mean it should stop there? Just because the talk of equal rights for women to vote was ridiculous, and then all of a sudden it became dangerous and people were killed for that, and now you talk about it's obvious that everyone should be able to vote, right? So these are the phases of any kind of revolutionary thinking. So in any case, I think we all agree with what you're saying, but does that mean we should stop there because other people think it's ridiculous? I mean, then we wouldn't really go forward from change, So that's maybe my little feedback on that. Khensani, what would you add?
I think that those 3 words are really powerful. And on that note, the word power, which Gabriela mentions in the comment, I think is something that we also acknowledge as quite a huge challenge. Of course, we as a collective function in a sort of way that is quite horizontal, because we all have different skills. We're really pluridisciplinary. We all come from extremely different backgrounds, extremely different, let's say, geographical territories, and meet at this oddly similar point that is transformative action in the built environment. And so when we think about dismantling power, we often try to, let's say, converse about what that means from within the sites and within the institutions that we're in. And so we see it as a sort of, as Solange has mentioned, a revolutionary thematic, but at the same time, something that is quite particular and that is quite strategically planned out, such that we end up showing that there is a possibility of it not being ridiculous, dangerous, but obvious, that power doesn't need to be the driving force for collective action. Of course, we occupy both the margin and the center, as Bell Hooks would mention in her writing, in that occupying those two spaces requires having experienced the margin, and being at the center affords us the ability to understand the language without trying to seek validation from it. We try to, at all costs, blur that relationship, and by understanding the power dynamic of the center, in the end, we try to do and then prove by doing. Of course, as we emphasized again at the end of the presentation, the main challenge behind that is getting concrete commitment within a capitalistic structure, which tends to be quite difficult, but we don't let it stop us. But it can be really challenging and really tiring, but here we are, still passionate.
Amazing. And we have to say, Gabriela, we call Gaia. It's a friend. She is professor at UFBA, it's a university in Bahia. And she is part of a collective of Black women too here, called Terra Preta. I can send you the links. And she told you earlier, which is Matri-Archi. It's an inspiration for her. And
Black Earth, Khensani, which is pretty cool. That's all.
Yeah, Black Earth. And I have a dangerous question here. Trying to put together two important concepts that you present to us in these presentations about blurring the boundaries and this concept of movement and as knowledge. Knowledge. I forgot. I write it. And memory as knowledge, knowledge as movement, and movement as exploration. And that makes me think about the way how we see how Western minds see the spirituality, because when you see when you study a lot of I don't know, ancient culture, the spirituality, it's always something that you have to be aware that it's super important. So when you show this I don't know, maybe cultural manifestation of Jene, the seed that it's recovered, as a movement of spirituality, there is some kind of different perspective of what is spirituality through the architecture. It's not as we see now, the religion as a corporation or something like that. Maybe you can comment. It's not just a question, that's asked to comment.
Yeah, I can jump in, and maybe Solange, you would like to comment on the sort of construction and climatic responsive aspect of it, because I'm all first. But I think that it's interesting how you phrased it as what spirituality is through architecture, or that word through, in the sense for us, becomes as a manifestation of, or in response to. And we constantly ask ourselves this question, in that once let's say the supposed informal phenomena gets observed, analyzed, written, recorded, distributed, and to an extent therefore formalized, does that become the underlying blueprint or driving point for it to manifest itself again? Or does it lose its value through going through that sort of, let's say, clinical process? And we really have to keep ourselves aware in this regard, in that we are also constantly producing. Of course, our opinions become snapshots of a specific time. So when we write in 2015, 2018, 2020, we're quite explicit about the fact that these ideas are also open to growth, but that's not always how it's interpreted, and that's fair. And so on the let's say the antipode, or the complete opposite, would be simply looking at architecture, the architectural discipline, and its really incredible visual capacity to manifest ideas from the intangible, or to translate, even though that word derives from the original, let's say, Latin word, which means betrayal, which is tricky, but to sort of find a way of communicating intangible issues, challenges, opportunities in languages that are really, let's say, universal, tactile, and read through spatial motifs. And in the sense, the Genet case study becomes quite interesting for us, in that it is a manifestation. And what happened was that UNESCO at some point stepped in and identified it as, UNESCO comes through, and wow, this needs to be preserved. And so there's limited access through this, supposedly, and I'm not disputing UNESCO. I think that there are good and bad things, but I'm constantly critical. UNESCO came in and decided, we need to preserve this and do some renovation, so there will be limited access to this sort of crépissage for X amount of time. I think it was something like 2 years. And this created a huge sort of uproar from the community, because, of course, that is the most clinical treatment of their built environment. And if the city does sort of become a little bit rough around the edges, and of course, this is in an ideal context where the climate is not constantly changing and the mud can actually be reproduced as it has been historically. If that is the case, then there are ways in which that flux, the way that humans treat, the way that citizens treat that city, there are ways in which they can adapt and adopt to a city that was never intended to live beyond the lifespan of the existence of its citizens. So long as the citizens exist, Genet will exist, sort of traditionally. And so it's a really interesting comment and provocation to us too, which we use as a driving question and way to answer some questions, because that the way in which we see this production is not to create a blueprint, but to create a series of snapshots which we can reflect on and try to develop into, yes, institutions, so that it can be widely distributed. So institutions just become a vehicle for widely distributing, rather than widely excluding and therefore erasing really important information in a planetary context. Solange, I don't know if you want to add to that huge chunk of information I just said.
Well, I mean, I will maybe just bring on another perspective to not to like leave your part and maybe hone in on the question itself that is actually quite funny, because it reminds me a lot of me talking to my grandfather, who is Nigerian, of Igbo culture. And many a times, I would ask him things like, hey, grandpa, it's your birthday. How do you say happy birthday in Igbo, right? And I grew up in Lagos, which is a Yoruba area, Yoruba land. And so I'm also learning different words in Igbo. And then he looks and he's like, my dear granddaughter, you don't understand. We don't have one birthday in our culture. We have many, 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 many birthdays. Like we celebrate the first day we went to school. We celebrate the first day we did that. We celebrate this. And there's no one day dedicated to you, in the sense of like the day of your birth, you should do a cake for your mom, because like she's the one you should be celebrating, not you. Like you didn't do anything to deserve anything. So the concept of that is already completely different. And that already explains a lot of the ways that the society works from the inner out. And when you talk about how do you manifest the different points of spirituality through a medium of architecture, the question in itself could be also seen from another set of values that don't see spirituality and life separated, where in many of sub-Saharan African nations, in particular Central and Western Africa, you do not have a separation of now we are praying and going to church and now we are living, because life is in symbiosis with the living and the dead and the living, the spiritual, the physical. And so they coexist with equal value. And so when you start looking at other cultures that are let's say that are more internal or external oriented, other from the West, if we take the West or Greenwich as our starting point for some random reason, but maybe the planet is upside down and Africa is the top as the global north and the global south, which is a play of words that we're actually looking into in our next article, hopefully, because what is the global north and what is the global south, apart from a geopolitical farce of superiority and inferiority complexes that come into it? So at the end of the day, when you start going into other ways of living, the question of how do you put spirituality into architecture wouldn't even be the question. The question is, what was the spiritual aspect that was being questioned, or that was being put into the fact of saying, oh, this is something that we must remember. We must pass this down through generations. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a dance, we're going to make a song, we're going to make a lyrism, we're going to memorize it, and we're going to pass it down through a way of knowledge, sharing, preservation, etc. Be it from the Quran to the Torah to all the sacred books. It was also all oral, and it was also put down. Like if you look at the Greek translations of the New Testament, it was all, you had indications of how the sounds would be done, so people could memorize it better. So that is a form of spirituality that was also a part of knowledge, in the sense of going into that. So when you put that into architecture, what is sacral architecture? When people would build for the gods, when people would be out of their ways to bring so much detail to exalt the existence of spirituality. So I mean, it's an open-end question. That's my point of view from it. And if I want to answer like an African, it doesn't make sense. But if I want to answer like, an architect, it could be taken in a completely different way, which I think the answer to of that already, because that's also, it goes into, the masses. It goes into how is religion, what is spiritual, what is magic. At the end of the day, we don't know, so we're just here living, existing, and trying to love one another. So in any case, if that's spirituality, at least on my personal understanding, it is love. And if that is what it is, love of your environment, love of your brother, your sister, be it blood or not blood, that is what should push architecture, because that is the spirituality that should be within architecture to move it forward and make it more relevant. It's not an egocentric point, which is the opposite of the circle with the dot, as we call the symbol of spirituality in Bantu language. Yeah, I'm going to stop there. Sorry. Yeah.
It's amazing. It was amazing. And it's amazing because spirituality in this sense is more like these three things: knowledge, movement, and memory all together. And it's thank you. We have another question here from Juan, which is a white man, so okay. Regarding the vernacular architecture response to climate, being reconsidered in face of climate change issues, would you say it is in the ridiculous, danger, or obvious stage?
Well, I mean,
Obvious.
Obvious.
well, I would argue a bit differently. I do think that it's obvious to probably many of us in this talk right now. What is obvious requires what is acknowledged and what is recognized, or what is even considered. I think, given this is also an issue we face in the digital scape, it's so easy to skip, to just swipe and ignore, and actively be okay with doing that. We see it in even spaces that are seen to be extremely expansive, like the media, where there's also a limitation in space. So while there is an ongoing, a very long-standing crisis in Nigeria, Donald Trump and all of his sort of Twitter antics are taking up the exact same amount of space on media in something that is seen to be quite expansive. So this sort of design and format of how we interpret information today, which is it's increasingly becoming the new normal online, has also created this really risky situation of being able to ignore and not recognize by choice without that being an issue. Of course, there's only so much we can keep in our brains. And so I think that for us, given our sort of, our underlying information before this talk, before experiencing each other, before experiencing places that we can encounter as familiar, it is obvious. But I think that something that is quite evident and present for everybody is the danger signal of the coronavirus, and the coronavirus being a potential, let's say, small little obstacle in the greater climate change, the greater climate change crisis. And so I would argue that we're in a very dangerous phase, and unfortunately, it has not become obvious to many people, or else capitalism would have taken a pause. There would have been all kinds of, let's say, bailouts to this abstraction of money that doesn't even physically have a connection to the worth that it was extracted from the historical extraction, which we're all still fixated on, and exploited, and sort of the continuation of exploitation from resources that were once physical. So I would really highly argue that it's still in a very dangerous phase, and as soon as it becomes obvious, then it becomes hopeful.
I mean, I would follow on to that, because even today, when we say that, women's rights should be on the obvious side of things, it's still not obvious for everyone. And I totally and fully agree with the end of the day, especially with the way that Google and research engines show you what they predict that they think you should know, and to be able to come out and branch out of a sphere that is contrary or contradictory to what you should, or your comfort zone of what your expansion on the web of information can get to, is also quite regulated. But then I just reread his question, and I would like to just point out two things regarding, so one is an allegory, and the second one is a definition of the word vernacular that comes from Roman law, and it means everything that is produced within the household for consumption, within the household, and not for sale or exchange, is called vernacular. And I'm just reading this out of a quote from a book called Learning from Vernacular. It's interesting, but it has good specific codes. So when you think about the fact that everything that is produced for the household is used within the household, and that was what was driving human beings from the beginning of time till today to use and create culture patterns that have been solidified into standards and ways of building and systems of figuring things out, from road buildings to the invention of the wheel to how to put the pillars on the stone head, just building the basics of shelter. So it all came from surviving and being autosufficient. And from the moment that we have derived into a form of excess driven mainly by capitalistic practices, we are away from the vernacular. The question is, what is the new vernacular? This is what we were trying to also establish. And then if you want to talk about ridiculous, dangerous, or obvious stage, I would just want to, for me, it's obvious, because I'm also a researcher, and I'm also was teaching at university as an assistant. And this was part of like all the research I was also doing regarding where architecture was, what it was happening in the modern movement of architecture in sub-Saharan Africa in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s. And the fact is that the exact same SDG goals, UN agendas, everything that's going on today they've been talking about this since the 40s, 1940, Second World War. The same discourses have been reused and reused and reused because the agenda is in the ones that are leading. It's a show. We're living in a matrix, and we need to accept that we're living in a matrix, no matter how funny that might sound. But The Matrix, I sincerely believe, was a documentary. And in that sense, if you think of it like that, you need to understand that, okay, ridiculous, dangerous, or obvious goes through a stage of privilege. Who is gaining privilege and who is losing privilege? If you're going to lose privilege, that stage is not going to happen very quickly. That's the other reason why intersectional space came out, and that's how feminism moved from being led by mainly white women in America that were driving it against it, because they said, how can Black men vote and white women can't vote? That was the reason that feminism started, because white women refused to accept the fact that a Black man that was given freedom because of the abolition of slavery was given the right as a human being, meaning that he should also be able to vote as an equal man. And then that is what stirred feminism for equality. But then intersectionality then broke out in the sense of there are also so many other people that would be losing privileges if we strive for a good cause or for an equal cause of humanity, because unfortunately we're driven by an egocentric point of view that is something that has to one day, he came, he left, we need Jesus again, but who knows? Anyways, in the sense, this now brings me to the allegory, to maybe help you frame this in the ridiculous, dangerous, obvious, but that's every revolution or revolutionary act. Imagine you're sitting in a cave with some friends, and it's like, this is going to be very funny allegory. Okay, you're sitting in a cave, it's really cold, and there's no light. And so you need to burn something to like keep warm. It's hard for you Brazilians to understand this, but I understand you understand what I'm trying to talk about, because it's always cold. Vocês têm muito frio, não? Então, você é uma necessidade, de fazer foco, não? Esta coisa, não? So, you're there, you get stuff, and you're just burning it, and all of a sudden you realize that you've been burning books, right? So these books have like architectural drawings, like crazy construction techniques that have been developed, and you were burning it for the fact that it looked like a book, it smelled like a book, as in it had the same weight, it didn't look like anything more, and probably the other people couldn't read, but you can read, and you see that there's a value in burning this. The fact of vernacular that uses everything for itself, and the fact that Khensani was pointing out that we are burning the resources of fossil what do you call it? Wood. Like I was trying to think of the word in another language. It didn't work out there. Sorry. Fossilized wood, and wood is actually almost something that couldn't decompose unless it was put under so much pressure to become like liquefied, and had to get like these little mushrooms to decompose it over how many thousands of years. The fact of the matter is that we're taking that out to burn it again, not recognizing that the forest that we're living in, the cultures that we can navigate in, the spaces of the informal, the places that people live, is the library we are burning. We are burning a library to heat ourselves up, to power our computers and our iPhones, and to drive around and fly around the world or use cars and whatever we want to do. But we are using it the wrong way. We are not reading the text that is in our environment, that is in our society. And that is the problem of how, if we want to then take the point of vernacular to the next level, it's about saying, how do you start reading the actual value of what it is? And when everyone starts understanding that, that's when a new, ridiculous, dangerous, obvious stage will be maybe, you know, clarified on a more global or on a more accepted scale, in the sense of we can all accept that it's not correct to kill somebody out of frustration. But then again, how accepted is that onto other circumstances that we'll never agree as human beings? So that's also a point to accept.
And so if I can add to the description that you read of vernacular, I think it was quite interesting that it also explicitly mentioned that it's something that is produced, kind of learned in the home, not commodified. And what a contradiction that is, in that this question, which I also now reread, you know, vernacular architecture as a response to climate is something that is almost in constant tension with itself, because the commodified construction industry just looks to optimizing the material that's going to get the supposed urban structure up. And, you know, the idea of sustainability, classic optimized systems of, you know, include a few gadgets, include devices, and make the high-rise, all glass-glazed building somehow sustainable with some internal green space, you know, in the middle of Dubai. This is when, I think that's why we constantly try to work on our syntax ourselves in our collective and put them out in spaces like this to get, you know, critiqued back, in that our idea of optimization does not, it comes with an idea of degrowth, doesn't come with an idea of growth. And it also comes with the idea of a decommodified and a decommodified reliance on the built environment, which, again, as Solange said, would probably require a certain level of critical gaze and privilege, which would allow that process to revalue into something else. Because as soon as we lose commodified value, that value would probably shift somewhere else. And if that value shifts, hopefully into some sort of climatic focus, that would be, I think, really a hopeful fourth stage after it being obvious, I think.
And it's amazing how you respond to this kind of questions, because it shows how you are deep in this kind of subject, the history of your studies. And it's clear too when you present your projects, because it's in terms of scale or physical scale, your project is small, but in terms of conceptual or philosophical scale, your work is huge. It's like a table for a woman to trade these little cakes. It's small, physical, but there is some physical and conceptual, philosophical and conceptual density, and this is for me what was amazing in this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Marco, do you have some?
No, in fact, I was thinking about here, and all this discuss. You have this beautiful mix between theory and practical. It's very difficult to access here in Brazil. I don't know if Vada knows a big example for that, but we have a small separation here between these two fields of the I don't know, these fields, and it's very nice to see the construction of this I don't know, this presentation between these two fields, you know. Here in, I don't know, it's amazing. I'm very happy to see that here. I don't know if you have another comments or want to finish this our presentation with a message or something like that.
Yeah. I think if this Gabriela talk about Nego Bispo, but we can show you. It's a Brazilian quilombola intellectual, talks about the cosmological, territorial, and defense thinking about city and materialities based on this regime of relations with the world. It's amazing, this. And we can send you the link of Nego Bispo too. So
maybe you can just add a comment. Look into Vastu, just on the other side of the planet, and it's very, very, very similar.
And sorry?
Vastu architecture that comes from Hinduism, and it has the same points of how cosmology and territory and space around the house has different energies. It's like the feng shui of India, or at least of Hinduism, and maybe this is another variation of it. And it's wonderful to be aware of these different approaches. I think it's also something that we can all learn from our humanity as common patterns of existence that are manifested. But would be great. I'll be really interested. We will be interested, obviously, to get the link and go into that.
And it's important to say, because here in Brazil, we always make jokes about feng shui, for example. This traditional way to see space, including me, I used to do this kind of joke, and like more comparing to astrology or to some not so serious, but feng shui as Vastu that you are saying, it's a way to see the space, in this case, like in relationship with the world. It's amazing. So I want to thank you one more time. I don't have word to describe this presentation. Thank you very much.
Show the ball.
Show de bola. Show de bola. Thank you very much. And thank you for your patience with our English. So.
Yeah, thank you a lot.
Translating.
Thank you so much for inviting us and having us. And we are really inspired by this space. And yeah, it's really exceptional that in the most intense moments that the globe at least feels at once, there's some possible exchange in ideas that could obviously or inevitably see us finally drawing from our own localities. So we will be following. We will continue following.
Right.
Thank you.
Amazing.
And we're always
thank you so much.
And feedback. If anyone wants to get in touch with us, we're really responsive.
Yeah. And when it comes to materials and any other way of applying our knowledge as spatial practitioners, we are also very interested in collaborating with any other kinds of collectives that are working with natural materials in order to use local or, local techniques regarding construction, regarding just understanding the material inside out, because we believe in Matri-Archi that is the only way to design with a material once you understand it on the raw. And so we also do collaborative workshops, which we will bring again next year or whenever the end of the Corona years shall arrive. But just to know, you can just keep up on our website, and It would be really wonderful to be able to keep up with the discussions that are going on in your institution. It's important, it's fundamental, and it's a great pleasure and privilege to be here. So thank you very much also from all over.
Okay, we can stay more 5 minutes. I will end the broadcast. Thank you very much. Obrigado a todo mundo que ficou com a gente até aqui. E até semana que vem. Não vai ter 15 dias, não vai ser daqui 15 dias. A próxima é dia 31, com a Paula Nascimento, uma arquiteta de Angola. Tá bom? Valeu, gente. Obrigado.